In this second lecture, I want to give a very high-level overview of the history of HTML. I don't want to go into a great deal of depth on this because there's plenty of material which is as easy for you to read as it is for me to read on, and it's available on the internet. So have a browse around if you want to find out a little bit more. But the reason why I want to do this is just to pull out one or two key issues about how HTML has evolved over the last 20 years or so. So that's the purpose. That's answering my first point there. Why worry about the history? Well, it helps you to understand how HTML is today by looking at how it's evolved. And to do that, I'm going to give a very quick rush through the HTML timeline and bring out these points. So let's go through very quickly. Going back to the origin of the internet, well known. So I'll gloss over this quite quickly. For defense reasons, the ARPANET was designed, key design released in 1967, and that evolved as a network across the USA. At a similar time, Janet in the UK was developed as a network for educational services, and within the US, ARPANET was extended with CompuServe as a network for non-military usage for small businesses. And those started to be used for transferring files in a somewhat unstructured way. The next development was the Internet Transmission Protocol program. TCP/IP was developed to enable different networks. By 1974, there were a range of different networks using different protocols to communicate within those networks, and that needed some element of standardization, and that's what TCP/IP enabled to happen, with ARPANET to then connect outside the USA. And in a sense, 1982 was the birth of the internet. And then on top of that, we started to see the origin of the web itself, or what we know as the World Wide Web. So it's a layer on top of that, some technology on top of that. And it started off in two camps. Within the USA, for educational purposes primarily, Gopher was released by the University of Minnesota, and clients for Gopher were developed by a number of organizations, and it was used both within the USA and Europe and the rest of the world, and indeed still exists. You can still find clients for Gopher and ways of getting standard web browsers to use Gopher services, to access Gopher servers. More or less at the same time, Tim Berners-Lee was struggling with a similar problem within the European Centre for Nuclear Research, CERN, over at Geneva, based at Geneva, but spanning 3 countries, as is well known. Tim Berners-Lee, again, as is well known, was a physicist, but he was wanting to enable the very significant number of researchers at CERN to be able to share documents. And in 1991, he released the first web server, web browser, and version of HTML. And in fact, many of the elements of that first design of HTML still are supported in the current version. And there was, behind that, a vision of a World Wide Web. So Tim Berners-Lee called that the World Wide Web. Two things then happened. We had two possible ways forward, one with Gopher, one with the World Wide Web. More or less at the same time as the University of Minnesota introduced license fees or proposed license fees for Gopher, CERN released into the World Wide Web, the tools that Tim Berners-Lee had provided. And that in itself was a key milestone and reflective of how the web has developed since that time. that what happens is certain technology gets released into the public domain at not for cost usage. And on top of that, then monetization is done through usage of that, not through development of the core technology. So as a result of that, it was www that took off and started to pervade the world. At a similar time, we started getting browsers developed by other organizations. Mosaic was the first one of those. Netscape arrived very shortly after us at that, and many of us that were using the web in 1993, 1994 were comparing the relative merits of those two. They had different features, and in themselves they started to push forward HTML because they had certain features which were supported within those browsers, and you could design for a specific browser. But that was beginning to move the development of the web and HTML into a rather difficult phase, because there was, to an extent, a standardization approach, but there were also browsers that were rapidly generating new ideas and implementing features for their own particular variant of HTML. In response to that, Tim Berners-Lee's next step was to found the World Wide Web Consortium with an aim of promoting a standards-based approach to the development of HTML. It took a little while for W3C to have any significant impact, but it gradually built up support from within the industry, and we saw in that time an evolution of a series of versions of HTML, but a key one was the release of HTML4, where during the intervening 3 years, HTML had gone through a number of evolutions, and the decision of W3C, with a lot of support from the industry, was to use HTML to focus on semantic elements. Up to that point, you would see support for a mix of layout, design, styling included in HTML. From 1997 onwards, the focus of HTML was on semantic elements, marking up content, not styling. Of course, the point there is that a lot of websites had already been developed, and as a result would continue to be developed, where there was a mix of content type within the document, not just pure text, but also elements of styling, elements of user interaction, and so forth. And it's taken a long time to get away from that. With the promotion of XML at the same time as a way of exchanging content, then there was, from 2001, a move to make HTML valid XML as well. That turned out to be a wrong direction. There were a number of issues with that. I won't go into the huge amount of, I won't go into any detail about that at all. But that turned out to be a wrong choice. And again, the reason for mentioning that is that you will see reference to a number of XHTML document types in existing websites and many textbooks and so forth. We're not going to focus on XHTML at all. The decision of W3C, in conjunction with industry and the way a number of browsers were going at the time, was to restart on pure HTML with HTML5. That was released in 2007. That was partly prompted, I think, supported to an extent anyway, at least by another event which is not on the timeline there, which is in 2003, the release by David Shih of the Zen CSS Zen Garden. Again, not so widely publicized, but a key point. The Zen Garden website is still available, and it is still collecting what the examples of what the original purpose was. So what was done with that was to release some standard content marked up with then HTML 4.01, I think, and invite designers to use that same content and style it in different ways using valid CSS. So it showed, it demonstrated what could be done by using HTML to mark up text content and then have that presented in a whole range of different ways with quite different impressions put on that content through using CSS in a separate styling document. And it's that stance that we take in this course, that HTML, as I've said in the last lecture, is all about marking up content. The styling belongs in a different file, a separate file. So the point I'm wanting to make is that the path to HTML5 has been a collective learning experience. We've seen W3C take a lead on this, but not so much in terms of defining what other people should do, but in terms of collecting experience, collecting together some of the best practice which has been shown in the various browser developments and beginning to consolidate that into standards. Those standards are recommendations. There's not remotely any kind of legal status enforcement of those standards. They only have support as standards through their consolidation of best practice agreed within industry. And as a result of that, the collective learning experience distilled out is to use HTML to consolidate on a pure semantic view of HTML. But you will find, as a result of that, there are some very mixed views and experiences still around, and those are reflected in some of the textbooks available. But use W3C as your reference point. If you're in any doubt, take a look at the W3C website and look at their view on the situation, and that is maintained up to date and should give you the definitive view. If you then follow that standard-based approach, you will have not only avoiding some of those issues I showed you in the last lecture about non-conformance across browsers inconsistency across browsers about how your content will be presented. But if you present your HTML in a standard-based way, as with the styling, but we'll come back to that much later, then you will find your HTML loads up quicker in browsers. It's consistent across browsers, not necessarily exactly the same across browsers. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later, but it will present well in all available standards compliant browsers, which all the modern ones are. And you will be starting yourself in a direction of making sure that you are also producing accessible content. Again, all of these things I'll talk about a lot more in a little during the course of the lecture. But the key point is HTML5 has consolidated on a pure semantic view of HTML. That's saying somewhat more succinctly the same line as I finished on in the last lecture, and that's an important point to end on.